Good morning again. I'm glad you're here very much. I'm glad to be here. And as I mentioned earlier tonight, we will have a report with slides of the work that went on this past week in Grenada, Nicaragua. And I think you'll be very interested and encouraged to hear the report, so I hope you'll come back at 6 o'clock. And if after my short sermon this morning, or long sermon, whatever the case might be, you have or have not brought any food, there's a whole line of stuff down there, so please stay and have lunch with us. I'm not surprised because our money's not the only money in the world that has a certain quote on the front of it, but it does have a phrase written on the dollar bill and also on our coins. Y'all know what it says on here? What's it say? In God we trust. There you go. Very good. Got your attention? Okay. Problem is, although we print that on our money, we know very well that for the most part, many in our country have turned their backs on God. It's funny how we pass that money around all the time and don't think about the country we live in. In God we trust. And yet, most people have pretty much pushed God off to the side. Now here's the situation, not just the politics or whatever, but the situation is because of our free country and the fact that we vote on what we like and don't like, you do that probably, many of you at least, it's kind of become in our nature to expect to vote on things and get things our way, right? Or at least hope that our vote will cause that to come about. In this free country, we want things our way. Now, the difficulty with that is that doesn't go with God in any way. My way doesn't go with God's way most of the time. When Jesus came down to this earth, turn to Matthew chapter 13 for just a moment. I want to read a passage here. He discovers, well, he knew already. He puts forth. We're getting some fading in and out here, are we not? He puts forth some comments about what God's view is of what's going on. This attitude of my way. So verse 14, Jesus says, in them, in our country, I'm afraid kind of overflowing into our thinking too, in them, the prophecy of Isaiah, way back hundreds of years before this time, is fulfilled, which says, hearing, you'll hear, but you'll not understand. And seeing, you'll see and not perceive. For, and this is the reason, the hearts of this people have grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes they've closed, lest they should hear with their eyes and see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and lest they should understand. And then verse 16. Blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. We have, I think, a struggle living in this society because of the nature of our country and the freedom and all, that we will tend to want things my way. And Jesus says, wrong move. I want you to hear. I want you to see what's going on. Now here's what we're talking about here. Turn to Genesis chapter 2. We'll look at some Old Testament illustrations here about this. Now, as you're turning there, I want to talk about a person that, in our terminology today, school terminology, would have said, made a 95 on the test, but she failed. And her husband along with it. Now, the person I'm talking about here comes from Genesis 2, and it's Adam and Eve. Now, Genesis 2 and verse 16, it says, the Lord God commanded man, saying, of every tree of the garden you shall eat. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. Now, Genesis doesn't tell us how long actually Adam and Eve lived in that garden before they went over and picked the fruit off the tree of good and evil. But it does happen. And I would say, if you were calling it out according to test standards, before Genesis 3 takes place and that first sin, they were hitting it 100%. But verse 1 of chapter 3 says, now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, has God indeed said, you shall not eat of every tree in the garden? Twisting it around a bit, the statement is. And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden. But the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. And she understood. It's real plain that that's what God's law was. And they've been doing good all the way up to this time. They've been tending the garden, taking care of things, and eating and living and doing just well, except that one tree, and they didn't touch it. But now comes along the idea, well, why not? And as you know well, after that, then she does eat the fruit after this temptation, and God comes and talks to them about that. If you were doing a sports analogy, you'd say, for instance, baseball, Adam and Eve were batting 1,000 up until that point, which means 100%. And in addition to that, even after that, well, I mean, one strikeout, what harm is that? But the harm was that it cost them their garden. And it cost them their life. And it brought a world to destruction, basically, spiritually speaking. Do you have a problem listening? Because it looked like Adam and Eve did pretty good up to a point. Are you bent on doing things your own way? Now let's just turn one chapter over to chapter 4. Cain and Abel. Now Cain and Abel come along the scene, and they're brothers, and Cain was a tiller of the ground, verse 2 says, and Abel was a keeper of sheep. Verse 3 says, and in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought the firstborn of his flock and of the fatness, and the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance, that's his facial expression, it fell. Now, here's the thing. Though it doesn't really tell us in there exactly, we understand from what's going on the implications that God already given them descriptions on how they're supposed to be sacrificing. And somewhere along the way, Abel kept doing it and Cain stopped. It displeased God. And instead of Cain correcting what he was doing wrong, the sin in his life, the fact that he knew he was displeasing God, he got mad at his brother instead. Now, God comes to him in verses 6 and 7 and talks to him about this problem. So the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door. And its desires for you, but you should rule over it, as if it's possible to get past this. Cain, are you going to listen to God, or are you just going to do it your own way? Now, we have lots of opportunities in life to get suggestions of help from people. In relationships, people go to counselors or psychiatrists or our friends or whatever, and maybe you do that sometimes if you've got something, and you might poll, what do I do in this situation? And you leave after maybe accumulating some knowledge, and you say, okay, I believe I'll do this. But here's Cain having a direct communication to God about what to do. The best opportunity to gain the exact thing he needed to do was right there. God was providing it for him. And Cain says, you know what? I think I'll do it my way instead. Do you listen to what God says? I really hear him. Or you leave sometimes walking away saying, yeah, but I believe I'm going to do it my way. Let's talk about one other individual. Now, this one's from 1 Samuel chapter 15. The individual's name is Saul, and he has a counselor, you could say, that gives him suggestions directly from God. Samuel the prophet. God giving directions to Saul as king over God's people of what to do and doing battle and things like that. And here's the situation. Now Samuel says to Saul, the Lord has sent me to anoint you king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore heed the voice of the words of the Lord. Do you notice before he even starts out telling him what he's going to tell him, he tells him, this is not me talking now. And it's not just some suggestion. You're to heed the voice. And this comes from the Lord. It's not me. Have you ever had a scary dream where you felt like maybe Satan was after you and it just scared you to death? Or a nicer one where God comes and speaks to you? Well, this is no dream. God is actually talking to Saul through Samuel. And so Samuel's laying it out, and there's no doubt in Saul's mind that this is God telling him. And he doesn't just play around and mince words. He says, you pay attention to what's going on. This is from the Lord. And then, just in case he misses it, verse 2, thus says the Lord of hosts. Let's just make sure we'll establish it. And he goes on and talks about what he's going to do. God says, I'm going to punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he ambushed him on the way up when he came back from Egypt. And then verse 3 says, now you go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox, sheep, camel, and donkey. That sounds pretty tough. God knows what he's doing. And also you could say by listening to that Saul ought to be able to figure out, well, this is exactly what God means. He didn't say, now, are you sure you mean all? And he didn't discuss any of that because it's pretty clear. I want you utterly destroy. And in case you missed the point, don't save anything. Don't spare absolutely anything. And so he goes out and he does that. Verse 4 says he gathered the people together, he numbered them, and he put together his soldiers, and he went out and he attacked Amalek, verse 5. And he goes up against the city. Now, as you're going through all of this, he knows what he's doing. Saul is a commander, and he's a big guy. And he's put his life on the line. You would call it mortal combat. You ever done that for the Lord? People sometimes talk about how scared they are for them to go over to another country. I'm not going to Nicaragua. Y'all go ahead. We'll help send you down there. But we didn't put our life on the line. Matter of fact, the second trip we even stayed in an air-conditioned hotel. Now, it wasn't luxurious, mind you, but the air conditioning did run most of the time. But not like Saul. Saul went out there and fought in a deadly battle, back and forth, until everybody was slain. Nearly. And you think, wow, Saul, you did great. Verse 10. So Saul's coming back now. Now the word of the Lord came to Samuel, that's the prophet, saying, I greatly regret that I've set up Saul as king. For he's turned his back from following me, and has not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel. And he cried out to the Lord all night. Wow, what did Saul do wrong? I thought he was, maybe he didn't do Mortal Kombat. Maybe he ran back. Maybe he chickened out. And he sent his guys out there. Verse 12, so Samuel rose early the next morning to meet Saul, and it was told to Samuel, Saul went to Carmel, and indeed he set up a monument for himself. There's something to think about. And he'd gone around, and he passed by, and he'd gone down to Gilgal, and then Samuel went to Saul. And Saul says to Samuel, blessed are you of the Lord, for I have performed the commandment of the Lord. I did it. And Samuel said, what is the bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen that I hear? What do you mean? The Lord said, utterly destroy, do not spare. Do I not hear bah out there somewhere and moo? You got some guys that are imitating animals in your army? What is this noise I'm hearing? And Saul has to back up. Well, I spared the king and some of the best stuff, as he goes on, because we're going to sacrifice it. God didn't ask for that. So we can say to Saul the same way, are you hearing the Lord of hosts? Or are you just doing things your way? Now Saul will come up with an excuse as you read down through the context. Well, the people wanted me to do this, and they wanted to come sacrifice. Well, maybe they did. But this is God's anointed person who could have said, no, we don't. Because this is what God said. But he didn't. Now, we live in a society of people that aren't nearly as closely related to God as these. They aren't kings that go out into battle that hold God up high. We live in a nation full of people that have turned their back on God and said, I'll do it my way. And because of that, I'm afraid, being ingrained in us, we let a lot of things slide on ourselves, not realizing what we're up to. So you watch the generations of time when they come down in Jesus' time, and he comes up and he says, you're not listening to God. You're not regarding anything he says whatsoever. I guess some personal encounters with a couple of Christians on this last trip has caused me to really reflect upon this. For as much as we stand up and talk and proclaim all these things, if it's just hitting a brick wall and I'm going to do things my way regardless, oh, that was a great lesson, you're really right, but I'm still going to do it my way. It causes me to think about how much our society is just like that. And how influenced we can be by doing the same things. Now, I'm not talking about being perfect. I'm talking about not a moment where you've got a situation, you fall into sin, temptation comes in. I'm talking about a blatant disregard. I know God says this, I'm going to do it this way. Because this is the way I'm going to do it. I get to choose. And we do have freedom in our country. So a guard was lost, a brother was lost, and a kingdom was lost. because individuals said, nope, my way. And everybody lost. However, there is one person I want to talk about here too, in 1 Samuel chapter 3. And that's Samuel himself. Samuel has an interesting background. His mother, bless her heart, had to wait a long time before she got to have a baby. And she finally promised God, you give me a baby, you give me a son, I'll give him back to you. And that son was Samuel. So as a young boy, he gets presented to the temple, to the priest there. And the woman, Hannah, says, this is the one I prayed for. I promised God he'd go back to you. You take care of it. Could you imagine a mother taking her only son and doing that? So here's little Samuel growing up under a prophet priest named Eli. And as it's going on, it's interesting that verse 1 says, now the boy Samuel ministered to the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no widespread revelation. God's saying, there should have been, but I've stopped talking to my people. And I have a feeling I know why. They stopped listening. They're going to do things my way. So God says, go ahead. You know people like that? That you're trying to help do whatever, and you keep giving them encouragement, well, you ought to, and they're not going to listen. They listen, maybe they smile a little bit, but they do things their way. So, right at the very beginning, God's saying, I'm tired of my people. My people now. He's not talking about the pagan world out there. They've stopped listening. I've stopped talking. I'm wasting my breath. The little Samuel comes along,